want to start this session actually by providing a bit of an apology because, and this is totally on me, the invite that went out, and it's been pointed out by our wonderful colleagues in the Ally Network, was perhaps still used some slightly clumsy language, and that, like I said, it's on me, which was leveraging pride creatively, which to some extent makes it sound as though the intention here is to, from a brand perspective, piggyback on pride for a brand's own benefit, and that is absolutely not the intention. Just to reassure people, what we're actually doing is quite the opposite, which is thinking how brands can leverage pride, or rather, brands can leverage themselves to support pride. That's the point. So if I had another stab, I would call it something more like this, about how to ensure appropriate brand communications and creativity to engage with pride meaningfully, authentically, and effectively. And actually, the reason this came about is because, and you might ask why we're doing this now in July rather than in June when most pride activity takes place. It's because we were starting to see in the I&D team what probably can be described as rainbow watching, particularly on places like LinkedIn and Twitter. You'll have seen this as well. Everyone's sticking a rainbow behind their logo, and that's their bit of wading into pride. And I'm not saying these brands here are not doing things behind the scenes as well, but it felt like there was a lot of lip service being paid and perhaps not a lot of depth going into this. So, but I will say the focus today is not on how organizations are structuring and how their policies exist for people and their teams and all the rest of it, and nor is it about how Kantar promotes LGBTQ+ in our workplace, although that obviously is tacit in the background of all this. What we're focusing on today, just to be clear, is creativity. So how can we support marketing colleagues, and we've got two in our panel today, how can we support them as they think about how they leverage their brands to support LGBTQ+, the community's causes and the conversations? And the first thing to say, and this is something I borrowed from Lynn, I hope you don't mind me stealing this thought, Lynn, right up front, is that not every brand has to go big into pride themselves if it doesn't feel authentic to their position and their maturity as a brand. Pride isn't Christmas, put simply. So you don't have to dial straight in and go in big with something just because everybody else is. It may not be the right stage of your brand maturity or where you activate to do that. And in the same way that, you know, we can realistically expect Pret, M&S, Waitrose, you name it, to have a turkey and cranberry sandwich at Christmas, I do think some of the other executions we've seen, like this one from M&S, arguably is a little bit clumsy. And increasingly now, you won't get away with it either, because communities, those in the community themselves, but also more generally, people are starting to call out rainbow washing. And when people perhaps are coming in trying to show allyship, but doing it clumsy and doing it as lip service rather than more deeply. So today's session, I'm going to build on some of the great work that came out of the session that was run about 6 weeks ago around the progressive portrayal of different groups in advertising, and how it's actually a really powerful thing to do. And there's a couple of great learnings that came out of this. But the point, if I try and summarize the whole hour session, which is slightly crude, into one slide, the point is this is a spectrum. To show your allyship for any group, and in this case, LGBTQ+, you don't have to go either all in or all out. There's a way of doing it that allows you to appropriately engage and show your allyship in more softer ways than, you know, on the right, we've got quite a kind of what we might call more of an extreme example, where their whole purpose is around supporting transgender visibility. So the slightly more softer ways of doing it, which is inclusive casting on the left here, McCain Australia had a series of families in there, one of their recent ads, and one of them just happened to be a family with two dads. And in the middle there, we've got the story that revolves around the issue. In this case, it's a transition of Gemma to James and her story, his story now. But it itself is not necessarily active. It's not calling for action itself. So it sits somewhere in the middle. And this is an award-winning ad that I think many of you will have seen. So that spectrum we're going to kind of unpick in this call with our panelists. But before we get to them, I wanted to get to you guys. And here, this is your session, your chance to ask questions will follow in a second. But I also just want to get your engagement right off the bat so we get a bit of understanding of what we think. So please grab your phones, and on your regular web browser, whatever that is on your phone, on mine it's Safari, go to Slido. And that's sli.do or slido.com. Both will take you to the same place. You'll see a screen like this. And then the code I want you to write in, wasn't feeling terribly creative, is pride. Once you get in, you'll see two kind of tabs, Q&A and polls. For now, I want you to go to the polls tab, where I'm going to ask you our first question, which is, very simply, it's an open question. Which brand do you instinctively first think of as taking the lead on these issues, LGBTQ+ in comms, in their marketing? So I will open that, and by magic, hopefully, yes, it's working, you will be able to drop in your thoughts here. So don't think too long, just give us a couple of ideas. Here we go, straight off the bat. Durex, ASOS, Mac. Yeah, Mac's done some great stuff on transvisibility. Starbucks again, gave you a clue there, didn't I? But that's perfectly legit. Absolute Vodka, yeah, they've done some really colourful Pride bottles, I remember, and Smirnoff. And Nike's always in there whenever we talk about I&D, which is great, and to their credit. Cool. So a few ideas straight off the bat. That's helpful. Skittles, yes, they've done their removing the rainbow packaging, which has been interesting. I think quite clever. Okay, cool. Well, I'm going to that's just to frame it, get a few thoughts first out there. I'm now going to ask you a question which has multiple choice answers, and it possibly seems a little bit dark, but there's a purpose to this, I promise, because we're thinking a lot about marketing and how it activates, especially for our global brands across the multiple regions. So, sadly, in how many countries is being gay still deemed a crime, in inverted commas, punishable by death? It is actually seen as a crime still in 69 countries globally, which is quite scary. But where is it actually still a capital punishment offence? So if I make this live, it's a simple choice of one of those 5 options. Let's see what you think. And you've all gone in quite high, which is depressing, but I actually have to say you are on the money. Because effectively, wherever there's still Sharia law, this is a possibility, unfortunately. So yes, the answer is 10 to 12. And yeah, we've seen a lot of this on Twitter, and it comes up again when we talk about rainbow washing, that very often brands that lean in and add the rainbow to their logo, we will see that will happen in some places but not others, because truthfully, perhaps it's reasonable to say that it would be unsafe to highly promote Summit in certain regions. So it's a really difficult line to walk. Now, I'm quickly going to share some data, because we're Cantor after all, just to sort of frame this again. And the first thing is to look at, if we look at LGBTQ plus as a community itself, like many other communities, it is growing. It's now 5% of the world population, and you can see a huge buying power that, of course, brands are likely to be interested in. But the reality is there's actually only 1% of ads overtly show gay or lesbian people in their advertising. So that, I guess, tells me that there's a bit of a first mover advantage here still for the appropriate use of the community in the way you market to that audience. And interestingly, just from our link database, if we look at a few of the kind of diverse kind of communities that we've tracked here, you can see that actually from our facial coding and link, LGBTQ plus actually gets the strongest visceral reaction from consumers when they express themselves watching one of those adverts. So it's a powerful effective way to get the attention of consumers. We're also seeing that it actually is driving sales uplift in our unstereotyped metrics, and that is actually growing quite fast. So again, there's momentum behind this. People recognize it, and it's important. And I guess the 2 headlines that came out of the portrayal of advertising webinar that I thought were interesting is that you don't have to actually look like somebody else to share their experiences. You don't have to be disabled to understand their way of life. And likewise with every other community, whether it's leading on Black Lives Matter or LGBTQ plus, you name it. And so therefore, using underrepresented groups won't hold your advertising back. It actually will add to its power. That's the point. Again, in Link, we've seen that when we look at LGBTQ plus specifically, they test ahead of our norms in the database 3 out of 4 times. So in terms of driving brand recall. So that's the positive element, why, of course, brands are interested in this and want to support the movement and also, let's be clear, market themselves in that context. But it is also worth looking at some of the other areas here that make this a little bit more difficult and why it's nuanced. While we see great distinctiveness for advertising featuring gay and lesbian characters, actually sometimes the message that's conveyed within is actually lost because of that distinctiveness. And we see that against the norms, it's actually often 18% less likely than to pick up the new information in that advertising. And for those in the community themselves, there's a real feeling often that our advertisers are just including people that look like them to make up the numbers. And that came from a study with Unilever, which of course gives reticence to marketers. And in particular, P&G did a recent study, I think just in the US to be fair, where they polled some senior marketing and advertising professionals basically to understand how they felt about this space specifically. And actually, 81% of senior marketing people at big organizations in the US, massive amount, they think that inauthentic execution of LGBTQ plus will actually lead to a bigger backlash than not doing it at all. And hence you can understand some of the reticence. But also agencies are seeing it the same way. And we've talked about rainbow capitalism, how being called out for that and cancel culture is something they're all perhaps rightly fearful of. And the other problem is, given that it's, the community itself is complicated, there's even me saying it 10 times now, LGBTQ plus, the amount of acronyms themselves, it is a nuanced community. And therefore, again, I think advertisers and let's say some of the 50-something marketeers at these big organizations, perhaps they feel they don't understand it well enough to do it justice. And again, that gives them reticence. So that's the context. To remind you of the slide around the spectrum, the idea that you don't have to go all in or not at all, and how we're going to unpick this. And so now, enough of me, I'm going to introduce our panel. So again, before I do that, this is where I want you to go to Q&A tab and start asking questions directly in there, and I will moderate them from my phone once we've introduced the panel, and I'll stop sharing my screen in a second, and we'll ask those questions directly to the team. But let me start by giving a little bit of colour to who these people are, rather than just giving you their name and job title. So I've asked them, given that things are slowly opening up again, where in a non-COVID world, where would they be right now if they could be anywhere on holiday? And where are they actually, given that COVID is still a thing in many markets? So our first panelist would be, ideally in a perfect world, in his hometown of a native city of Chicago, down by Lake Michigan, and having a great time seeing his family. But the reality is he's going to spend his summer exploring the Dutch countryside, where nearby to where he lives in Amsterdam. And our first panelist is Ephraim Ayala, who's the Director of Inclusion and of Diversity and Inclusion and Marketing Excellence at Reckitt. So literally couldn't be more perfect for this discussion, I think you'll agree. We're also privileged to have another great client with us, who would, in a perfect world, be in Cortona in Tuscany, and in fact is in Cortona in Tuscany, because she's very, very kindly joining us from holiday, which is really beyond what we'd all expect. So I'm imagining her putting down her glass of Chianti and stopping tossing some spaghetti and olive oil, the rest of it, to join us very kindly. And she is Annabelle Cordelli, who is the VP of Brand and Marketing at Virgin Atlantic. Our third panelist would be at the Tokyo Olympics, soaking up the sport and the local environment in a non-COVID environment. But he's still actually got something pretty cool to look forward to, which is he's planning to go to Crete in September, assuming he's not pinged to self-isolate like many of the rest of us. And that is Phil Tier, who is Global Chief Strategy and Planning Lead at VML Y&R, and I work quite closely with on one of our main accounts. Also very subtly giving a plug to his book here, as you can see in this picture. And then finally, one of our own, who I've learned something new about, would be listening to Latin music and dancing to salsa in Cuba in a perfect world, but is instead heading back to her roots as a Lancashire lass back to near Blackpool this summer. It's Lynn Deason, who I'm sure everyone knows is our Head of Creative Excellence at Kantar UK. So that's when I stop sharing, and hopefully the panel becomes large. And I'll start by asking you in turn just to respond to that slightly wordy but hopefully interesting introduction to frame this. And Ephraim, perhaps I can come to you just to get your response in that context and your initial thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me, first of all. And I'm happy to take the question first in response to that. I think, why is it powerful to be inclusive of the LGBT community? And I think if we take that question up a level, like, why is it powerful to be inclusive as a business, is a key question we should all be asking ourselves, especially after the last year that we've had from a social justice movement perspective. And I think it's in asking that brands can define, does entering the LGBTQ plus discourse and space, do I add value to that? And I think most of us can, from a brand strategy perspective, it takes some discernment and thinking about does that make sense for my business? Because I think when you don't go through that process and ask yourself those questions and do enter this space with an activation, that's when I think you start to face some of the risks that you've called out, where the approach may be distracting from the core brand message, or it feels inauthentic and in earnest to the community that you're trying to be inclusive of. And so I think it is a fine dance that needs to be danced, but it's also a strategic choice that has to be made, not just a tactical, hey, it's Pride, let me throw a rainbow on my dishwashing detergent packaging, which we have finished dishwashing detergent, right? But from a Reckitt perspective, it's all about understanding, can we add value to that particular community and being inclusive of them? And I think you rightfully showed those examples of like representation versus inclusion, and focusing on the inclusion side. It is, our Durex business certainly has almost a moral obligation to be inclusive of that community, because if we think about the category that Durex sits in, that community faces stigma, faces lack of educational access to sexual health. And so as a condom brand, a lube brand, a pleasure brand, a brand that's meant to empower everyone to feel like they can be their true sexual selves, we have a bit of an obligation to be inclusive. So I think in that way, we're able to be powerful to that community, in alignment with that community, in a way that also feels natural to the brand, versus I can't have that conversation with the Finnish dishwashing team because we don't really have the legs to stand in that space. And so I think it's really about being able to ask your business that question, understand the lived experiences of any given community, not just the LGBTQ plus community, and to make that choice. And when you make that choice, make that choice. It's not just a choice that lives in a PowerPoint or an email. It is a 365-day activation. It is how you show up all the time. And it might flex. You might go deeper or further into that narrative based on inflection points like pride, et cetera. But it is a commitment that I think when you make it and you add value to that, you should be making it every day, not just within the month of June.
Brilliant, thank you. Annabelle, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you again for having me. Excuse my voice. I started my holidays, and in true holiday style, I always get this sort of that everything sets in, and I get always a little bit sick, lost my voice, so that's why I sound a little bit odd. But I'm really pleased to be here to be joining this conversation, because for me, it's just it's a conversation that's live in Virgin Atlantic every day, and something that I'm really passionate about, and I'm hoping just to lean into the conversation today and just hear what everyone is on everyone's mind, and learn from other people as well. But I share Anne's perspective on inclusivity in its biggest sense. And for Virgin Atlantic, that goes, we have a really long history in this space, and it started with Sir Richard Branson back in 1981. And it was, his activism. I think he had this student magazine where he was, creating a platform for inclusivity for gay community, which ultimately, and his actions ultimately led to the opening of Heaven nightclub, which is like the biggest, was at the time, I think, the biggest nightclub in Europe for the gay community. And what was at its heart was a place where there was to be yourself, a community where people could come together and truly be yourself. And that be yourself, truly inclusive culture is in the DNA of Virgin Atlantic. And that lives today as much as what it did, I think, from its early roots from him. People join our business because of that, because they subscribe to sort of the ethos, the values around inclusivity and all that represents. And therefore, for us, it starts from the inside out. All of our people get really engaged and want to be part of making a difference because they feel it's part of the sort of value set. And at the same time, as I said, we participate. Virgin Atlantic is a brand. I mean, we're coming up to Manchester Pride, Attitude Magazine host an awards event which we participate and partner in, and take a stand. So for us, it's about working out how we sort of galvanize our people and all the passion and effort internally and participate in a way that it absolutely does feel authentic for us. But it's about how we do that in a meaningful way that really makes a difference, rather than just participating to amplify partnerships or how our people feel. And for us, that is sort of one of the opportunities, but one of the challenges we need to navigate. So that would probably be my opening thoughts.
Fantastic. Just before I come to you, Phil, can I just remind everybody, hopefully it's possible you can start asking your questions in the Q&A in the chat function of Slido. Someone's just dropped one in. I'll have a couple if you don't. But when you start adding, hopefully a few of them, you can vote the ones you like to the top. So just to make that point. So I see someone just dropped one in. Thank you. But before we get to that, Phil, what are your initial thoughts on that context and how you think it relates from the creative point of view, the work you're doing?
Just unmute.
Oh, you've muted again. I think there you go.
Don't touch the buttons. Thank you, James. I'm Phil Tier, Chief Strategist at VML Weiner. I thought, James, it's sort of, why is it powerful for brands to get involved with pride, to support inclusivity, etc.? I think it's quite a big philosophical question, and I thought maybe there's a big philosophical answer to that. So if philosophy is how we answer the question, how could I live my life? Then I think pride is part of an answer to that question. So look, if you look at it, there's two forces in society at any one time. There are active forces of change, forces that are popping up, ever more interesting and new, different ways of living your life. And those forces are creative. In their very nature, they're the forces of human creativity. Inventing and reinventing again how we can live our life. And then there's reactive forces, the things that try to stop that change happening. Now, I think those are anti-creative forces. Those are suppressive forces. So whether it's, sort of extreme right-wing sort of politics, or it's repressive religions or whatever, anything trying to suppress an individual or a group's way of life is against that. Now, as a brand, you kind of want to be on the creative side. You want to be on the positive, progressive, new ways of living sort of side. And you don't really want to be associated with the sort of reactive. And it's quite hard to sit in the fence. Back in the 1970s, I'd imagine, in the 1980s, it was quite easy for brands to sit in the fence because the active force wasn't very strong. It was still relatively weak. But as those sort of forces grew, and pride grew through the 80s and through the 90s, and now right into sort of popular culture with major TV series talking about the history sort of the pride movement, sort of movies, it becomes harder and harder. There's a tipping point that's reached, and it's harder and harder for brands to sit outside that. If you show lifestyle and all you ever show is white, middle-class, heterosexual relationships in your lifestyle, you're going to be seen as one of the reactive forces. But to get in there and to be part of the positive, I think, we'll talk more about this later, I guess, but you have to. I went to Pride. I live in Brighton, and so Pride's a big part of the year down here. It's a big part of the summer, and sort of, the last one was 2 years ago, and I went along, as we always do, and we got to the sort of Pride Field, still ticketed now. You got to the Pride Field, and there was a Paddy Power stall there. Paddy Powers and bookmakers. Now, at first I was like, whoa. Now I had a vague, in my sort of memory of the Paddy Power brand, I vaguely remembered some ad, something to do with footballers and rainbow shoelaces and rainbow laces and things like that. But that was it. And I'm looking, why is this? Why is there bookmakers at Pride? Who is going to want to put a horse on in the 2:30 at Worcester in the middle of Pride? It doesn't seem right. But of course, Paddy Power were there, but they were there as a brand. And what they had was a stall with a great big bazooka in the stall. And every hour on the hour, they sounded the klaxon, and a crowd gathered round the stall. And out of the bazooka, they fired about 100 pairs rolled up into balls of big rainbow Y-fronts. You know, so, and it was a mad scrum as people tried to get a sort of souvenir of a sort of the wife runs to take home with them. So Paddy Power turned up. They brought their brand, they brought their irreverence with them, they brought their kind of, you know, characteristic silliness with them, and they added something to the experience. They added something positive and entertaining to the experience. So they weren't a reactive force. They weren't sitting on the outside. They were right in there as part of the forces of creativity. But they were doing it with being true to themselves and also with a bit of generosity, and a bit of fun.
Yeah. Great, thanks, Phil. And Lynn, finally, over to you.
Thanks, James. So I think you all know this is something I'm really passionate about, and particularly the importance or the impact that brands can make by how they show people. And we know that a sense of belonging is really important to everybody's mental well-being. And so I think whilst the focus might be placed on brands like Durex that Ephraim was talking about, who really can take an active stance here, I think equally we shouldn't underestimate just the importance of representing people positively and positive people portrayals. So those two characteristics you showed on the slide, James, looking at, you know, inclusive storytelling, we shouldn't underestimate the impact that can have. I'm reading a book at the moment which is all about attachment. And I think thinking about the other end of brands like Durex, the final chapter of this book is about heroes and thinking about the characteristics of people who are heroes. And I thought for people in that community, these brands become heroes. And in this book, it talks about the characteristics of heroes. So I thought it might be interesting just to share those with you to provoke some thinking. So they're energetic, feisty, non-conventional, go beyond expectations, take personal risks, make self-sacrificing, forgiving, committed, adventurous, brave, non-violent, flawed rather than special. So, you know, not perfect, have a passion for a cause, prepared to speak out, creative, courageous, patient. So I think if you're going to be a brand that is going to make a difference, then actually having those characteristics is really important. And in this book, it also talks about the animation by Hayao Miyazaki, you know, his wonderful films. And the author writes, one of the things that makes me love his work is his belief that a hero is an ordinary person who rises to a challenge. I strongly agree with that definition. And so I think, you know, brands can be heroes, but it takes marketers to be heroes. So I think as you, Ephraim, was rightly saying, if you're going to take this on, then you've got to own it wholeheartedly.
Brilliant, very interesting. I was trying to write those down as quick as you were saying them because they were really, really brilliant. Thank you. Right, I promised I'd start letting this be the audience's opportunity to ask questions rather than me, even though I've got some burning questions on the back of that. But the one with the most votes right now is quite a general one, but I think it's a very fair one, which is how do you overcome worrying about saying something wrong or that might be taken in the wrong way in this line of work, I guess, in this context? As I learned myself in the way I framed this session, I think you can see that it is easy to misstep, and therefore perhaps that puts people off. What would you respond to that? Perhaps Ephraim, perhaps I'll start with you again on that.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm trying to understand if the worry is in this context or the worry is as a marketer and your brand saying the wrong thing. But I think my answer is going to be the same. So knowledge is power, right? And knowledge will also give you that confidence. So if you're worried about you might say the wrong thing, it might be because you haven't exposed yourself enough to the experience or the community or the group or the challenges or whatnot. And so educate, right? And so I think it's similarly around the Black Lives Matter, there was a clear narrative that was like racism is not a Black people problem. Racism is a white people problem. White people need to educate themselves so they can solve their issue, right? So it's similarly like, how could you educate yourself? If you're worried, then if it's stuff that you're just kind of dipping your toes in, I think one safe space for a lot of people to educate themselves or expose themselves to different experiences and points of view is fiction content. Find content that is written by the community, led by the community that you're trying to expose yourself to, and just engage in the storytelling that comes from that particular group of people. I think it's a very safe space to, dip your toes in. And I think through being more familiar, becoming more aware and confident, you will worry less about saying the wrong thing, either in a setting like this, or in the brand marketing work that you're trying to do. For the Durex business, this commitment, we've really started to lean in the last few years. So, there was a bunch of stuff that happened behind the scenes to get us there. And one of them was we brought in partners like Stonewall to quite literally just educate us, because we were just not aware as a corporate community on the LGBTQ plus issues, and how Durex can potentially have positive impact. And so we would bring in queer sex therapists to better understand the dynamics. And it was all about, okay, we have to understand before we can feel fully confident that we're being productive in the discourse. And so if you're worried, just start to engage.
Great. Is there a build from anyone want to build on that question?
Yeah, I agree with I agree with what Ephraim has said. Absolutely. And we have a big network internally, and that is a great platform for us to talk about things. And you can be everyone, it's open to everyone, obviously. So we use that a lot when we've got either ideas, simple executions, and there's lots of feedback that we get internally, and I think it's the same sort of conversation that Ephraim was alluding to. The other thing for me is just being really clear about the brand point of view, and I think what your brand is standing for, because I think that you're going to have some confidence in some of these places, and there's always going to be this, are we going too far? Are we not? And there's going to be some experimentation within that. So I think providing it feels like you've done the due diligence around really trying to understand what that it is on point and that it fits with the brand, I think there's some things you're just going to have to try as well, and accept a level of, that you're not always going to get it right, and learn from that. And we certainly have examples where we've learned on really simple things like job adverts and things like that, language in some of those things, in some of the execution around advertising, good and bad feedback that we get. And there is no shortage of people writing into a customer care center, and I think really listening to that feedback and going, this was a brilliant portrayal. I've had a letter recently from a couple of ladies responding to some of the Easter activity that we had out. But equally, when we haven't got it wrong, as I say, we got loud and clear feedback on language in the job advert, and it made us go, gosh, are we really do we have a good enough understanding on the right language? And I think the answer was no. And go again, okay, what do we need to do better on that next time? And I think just acknowledging the mistakes as well.
That's what I was going to ask. When that happens, then do you publicly almost over address, or do you just sort of bury it and go, we've learned from a mistake?
No. I mean, look, a lot of these things, I mean, gosh, people think nothing about writing to our CEO on things like that. So those things go sort of far and wide. So I think our chief people officer, people want to know as well. I think it's part of the sort of the culture. People genuinely across the board, from our chief people officer, CEO, would want to know, especially if there's themes. I'm not on a one-off theme, but if there's themes of things we're not getting right, they generally want to know, what do we need to do differently to be able to address that. And on this job advert example, it was raised to my attention, someone in comms, someone in the people team, and it was like, okay, what steps are we going to do? And we've taken that, so a small group of people, other people were aware, and there's lots of examples like that we just go, right, well, we can't do that again, and let's put some checks and balances in. But I think it's taking steps in the direction that you're confident in, but then just learning from your mistakes as well. And yeah, of course, we let people know when we've let them down, if they're not internally as well. That's part of who we are.
Phil, I don't know if you've got some thoughts, but I suppose a question I might have is whether you've ever had to crisis manage one of your, you may not want to name them, but one of the brands you work with, where in responding to a misstep or anything like that. What do you think is, because things, people will get things wrong. Let's be fair. What do you think?
I was tempted to say, do your research, and sort of test what you put out before you put it out. I mean, I think we work with scene experts, and regardless of what the scene is we're getting into. And those scene experts can be people within the agency, but they can also be recruited in, sort of to work on specific projects, so that we're not assuming that we've got all the knowledge to hand and that we are the expert. We can sort of we'll collaborate with other people. That collaboration process leads to better ideas. That collaboration process leads to ideas we maybe not have thought up with ourselves anyway. So it's a dialogue, isn't it? And it's about having that conversation, that dialogue with the right people through the creative development process, so that you're confident you are. Because language evolves, doesn't it? What's acceptable in one period is not acceptable in another period, etc. And you got to be up with that conversation. And it's only by engaging with communities, with partners, with experts, that you can sort of you can be confident of that. But I can't think of any ads off the top.
No, that's all right. Don't do that. Lynn, did you ever build on that, or do you want me to jump to another question? No, I'm happy either way.
Yeah, no, I think I completely agree with Ephraim that understanding people is the key to this. So yes, you can self-educate, and you can also do, research in lots of different ways to understand the audience, to represent them authentically. I think there's another side to this, which is if you are doing something where you have a very strong point of view that is provocative, you can expect to get a reaction. So I think it's being prepared for that and listening for it that makes a difference, and knowing how you might respond when that happens. So that needs to be part of your planning process.
Really, really good point. I'm going to kind of amalgamate two questions that are broadly asking, I think, broadly the same thing here, and it kind of came out in that piece of research I shared from P&G. But there's a lot of groups in the LGBTQ plus acronym, apart from being difficult to say, and they all have their own challenges that are probably all quite different. And someone here in other questions pointed out that a white gay man's perspective differs from a black Muslim trans female's. So how do you address all of these, and should we? So how do you lean in on the community as a whole, but also the individual strands of it, I guess, is the question. Who'd like to grab that easy question? Go on, Ephraim. I can see you're ready. Let's hear what you think.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to take a pass. It is it's a philosophical question, right? When there are so many systems of oppression surviving and thriving, how do you know where and when to intervene with what group? Specifically, given the diversity within the LGBTQ plus community, for the way we think about it from our purpose brand building perspective, is where can we make an intervention that's going to add value to it? And can we make an intervention across that spectrum? So for example, when we think about gender identity and the role that we can play within that discourse, knowing that we are a leading voice within the sexual wellness category. I think someone mentioned it earlier, language is so key, is like, from a gender identity perspective, are we using gender inclusive language? Are we using gendered language? And how do we move that across every brand touch point? So scrubbing websites, scrubbing our search strategies and our keyword strategies, scrubbing our point of sales marketing materials as one dimension within that broader LGBT community. Of course, the L's and the G's and the B's and the T's all experience different barriers within the sexual and intimate wellness categories. And for us, it's about how can we intervene? And we may not be able to intervene everywhere, and that's okay too, but it's where can we make something meaningful happen and lean in. And for us at the moment there's just a critical gap in sex ed for queer, non-binary, trans bodies and youth. And so we have the resource, the capability, the network, the partners to start to fill that gap by collaborating with those communities to start to create the education that doesn't exist as the first step in providing value to all of the dimensions, not all of the dimensions, as many dimensions of that community. But again, it starts with that philosophical brand strategy question. Is like, do we have a role to play here? Can we add value? And then starting to ask yourself, where does that value come to life? And how do you show up to that fight for that particular community? Are you an ally? Are you an advocate? Are you an activist for that community? And what is your credibility to show up in that way?
Really interesting. That fit sounds it sounds so fitting to your brands and your portfolio. So I'm just wondering how you got to that journey. Was it a difficult task to convince, I don't know, the powers that be that this needed proper research and proper understanding, or how did that come about and how long did it take, I guess?
Yeah, I think all of our brands are on different journeys. Like I've mentioned, Durex has been in this space for quite some time, whereas other brands in our portfolio are really starting to think about the positive societal impact that they can have. At Reckitt, we really do believe that we can do well and do good at the same time. And so as we generate and propel our brands forward through purpose and understanding what that purpose is, it requires us to understand what communities we can disproportionately benefit and really make sure we're hitting the gas in those spaces, because that's how we can have that positive impact to society. And so each brand will have different things it can bring to society. And so it's about knowing that lane and sticking to it. And so it is a journey, it is discourse, but it takes the bravery to have that happen. And I think a lot of that bravery in a marketer's mind is informed by research and insight. So knowing that I have this community on the line and hearing my voice, it's like, how can you generate bravery within your client organizations to have the discourse, to seek the insights, to push, and especially if there's a very clear opportunity for the brand to have positive impact to a historically excluded group of people.
Yeah, I want to hear from the others. And I guess the question that's popped up here as well, I think builds on that, but maybe you can think about, guys, is someone's asked about, do you need to have the right representation in the C-suite in order to, I guess, grab hold of this properly? And I'm not expecting you guys to unpick your C-suite for us now, but I guess, is that something you feel like is a barrier to sometimes this happening well enough? I don't know, maybe Annabelle, Phil, do you have
I do. So we do have across all of our networks, of which this is one. We have our C-suite sponsorship across there. So our chief commercial officer actually is the sponsor of this group, and I think what that enables is an agenda topic, and it is on the exec agenda continuously because of the role that they're playing. So I do think that helps. I don't think that doesn't mean anything happened, because actually we had a lot of success before that as well because of the passion of the people in the business. But I do think it takes on another level because suddenly you get traction around initiatives, and I think it builds on the conversation we're just having here, which is where and how you can, make a difference. And I think a really recent example, our chief commercial, so we fly to the Caribbean, is a big destination, number of countries there, and as probably many of you know, they have discriminatory laws, against really archaic sort of laws. So we have partnered with Open for Business and actually undertaken some research to work out, well, how are we going to combat this? And one of the ways, because we don't believe it's right, but equally that is a part of the world that is very reliant on tourism. So it's how to sort of frame that in a different way. So we've been having conversations around the economic impact on that as well. So, there's a huge group of people who are just not prepared to travel to a beautiful part of the world because of this, discriminatory laws. And I think trying to work out how you can make a difference because it's the right thing to do, but in a way that makes sense for where you're trying to make a difference. So that, the Caribbean, they care about people coming to the country. So just talking to them about, other aspects about it's the right thing to do wasn't necessarily getting traction. Talking on an economic basis is getting traction. And that has been sponsored from our CCO. And I think that's a really live example now that was sort of, a couple of weeks ago. And it's those sort of initiatives that start to then get talked about, that start to get traction because senior people are involved and, not sort of taking no on those and trying to push forward and then, taking the troops of people, with them as well.
Phil, do you have anything?
Yeah, I think having C-suite, absolutely, is going to help in any culture. But I think the important thing that is that inclusivity and diversity is not hidden, but within the culture of the organisation. It's a visible part of that culture. VML have all sorts of We've got safe space conversations that go on. We've embraced pronouns and sort of people's emails, sort of letterheads, etc. You know, we've made diversity and inclusivity upfront and very visible within the culture. It's no longer something that's hidden away, you know, or we pretend this don't happen. I think that legitimizes, you know, sort of inclusivity within the organization. So it's very there, and it can be seen and it's visible.
Lynn, anything you want to add to that?
Well, I think the idea of intersectionality is what makes people fascinating, isn't it? And if you don't embrace that, then you are stereotyping people. So I think you know, why people still engage with stories that don't represent themselves is when those stories have a human truth in that they can connect with. So I think as long as you are telling stories that are meaningful to people in some way and tap into a human truth, then you will get engagement from people by making that emotional connection. And that's what companies should be seeking to do.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point, Lynn. And I think there's something about identity tells us so much about an individual, but it also tells us very, very little about an individual as well. It's very surface, whereas getting beyond the labels into connecting people through deeper human truths is how you create really powerful ideas.
Brilliant point. Thank you. I'm going to ask one very specific question because it has been voted right at the top, and it kind of builds on what you were just touching on, Annabelle. And you don't have to necessarily go into all the detail, but I suppose the question is about how do you, from a global brand point of view, take a purpose when you're going to markets where, for example, LGBTQ is criminalized. As I mentioned, there's 69 countries where that's still the case. So I don't know, it's probably a question really for Annabelle and Ephraim about the extent to which you try to, exercise the change, be the driving force. And when I mentioned leveraging pride, what we know is how do brands leverage themselves to support these movements and drive social change, given that we know that people historically, particularly now, don't rely on governments so much to lead those changes. So how do you manage that conversation? And maybe you can give us a bit of an insight on that.
And it's the question around when you take such a strong point of view that you say, that's it, we're not going to stand for it. Is that the question?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the point is obviously, in some cases, like as I mentioned right in the introduction, it may actually be dangerous to really amplify a story that could get people, in real trouble. And therefore, what do you do there? How do you manage that? Because not doing anything, arguably goes back to the very beginning of this around, is it rainbow washing? Is you just doing it to someone, this is not others? Phil and I were talking before this about an example of a brand who did it in certain cities in the UK and not others. It can be micro as well as hugely macro, where they know the audience is receptive. So to what extent is it marketing to those, preaching to the choir, or trying to drive change? And how do you balance that tightrope? That's what I think is I don't know there's a simple answer in the time we've got.
No, I'm not sure there's a simple answer on that one at all. And I think, I think you've got to assess what you're trying to do. It's back to the conversation about where are we going to have a point of view, where are we going to take a stand, and and doing some assessment around what feels like the right thing to do. And I think there's always going to be a range within that where you can take some really bold action and there's going to be some consequences for it. You can say, well, yeah, I can imagine all sorts of scenarios. Now, I suppose it's putting those through multiple lenses because they have to make sense, commercially, they have to make sense from a societal perspective, brand perspective, all of that. And I suppose it's balancing those things depending on, where you're trying to make a difference and what feels right. And I think probably pushing the boundaries every time. So if we had success on one thing, what do we learn from that? And can we apply that and go further the next time? And I don't think there's a one size fits all answer on this. I think it's probably using judgment on what you think is the right thing. And as far as what you can go, that feels right for the situation.
Ephraim, what's your quick thought on that, please?
Yeah, I mean, nothing more to add except for, what I was mentioning earlier. It's like knowing how you want to show up. And sometimes you may have the ambition of being this brand activist in your business, but there are realities. And so, maybe you're not an activist all the time in that particular region or market, but you better be an ally. And allyship may look like different tactics to that community in that space. And so you're almost more accountable for doing something that feels at least like an ally if you're communicating everywhere else that you're an activist or an advocate to that degree. So it could be as simple as like for LGBT restrictions in a market like Russia, it's like, well, we can still do gender inclusive language. We can still show up in ways that feels inclusive without explicitly breaking the law that exists there. And who's to say we won't decide one day to say, we're going to break the law and we're going to spark a conversation. I don't run the Durex business, so I'm not saying the Durex team is going to do that. But, you look at what Ben & Jerry's has done recently, and they've taken that stand. And it's, again, like Annabelle was saying, like, you have to be brave. It has to be the right thing to do for the business, but also the right thing to do. And you'll have to make that call. It's nuanced. It has to be.
I'm so sorry that we're running out of time, because I feel like we're really just scratching the surface of all the stuff we could discuss, and there are more questions, and apologies to those I didn't get to. I just want to give the audience one final moment, because I said we finish at 5:02, so we'll probably finish just after. I'm going to share my screen one final time and ask for a quick response. The first thing to just remind everybody of very quickly is a plug for the I&D team's Pleasure and Promote page, because it's all very easy to talk about this stuff, but actually we're trying to, as a group, inspire action. And I know this has more been about brand and creativity, but of course internally, the way our culture, the way we operate, there's a lot of learning here as well. So just to direct you in the direction, those of the Kantar team, towards our Pleasure and Promote page on Workplace, and remind you quickly as well of the team that's behind all of the many events that we run throughout the year. So please reach out if you've got comments and ideas. We'd very much welcome hearing those. But the final point, I just wanted to invite our audience to thank the panelists and just leave a very quick thought around what they've heard or learned, something they've reacted to today. And I've given you 5 words or fewer, ideally, or if you prefer, an emoji to have what you react to, what you've heard today. And I'm just going to open that now. Don't think too hard, because I'll have a blank screen. But chuck me some thoughts about an emoji and a couple of words about something you've learned from the panel today, or even just say thanks. That would be fantastic. And I'll send you on your merry way in a moment. This is in, sorry, the case that was not, this is in the polls section again, if you switch from there from the Q&A. Couple of people mentioning bravery straight off, 3 people, 4 people, or 3 people mentioning bravery straight off the bat, which is fantastic. People find it interesting, that's nice. Someone's got a rocket ship, always love to see a rocket ship. And yeah, we're seeing bravery coming across strong here, which is a nice reminder. And I'd love to have Lynn, you share those characteristics of heroic brands, because I think it's worth saying, yes, be brave, but I love the point you were making about also, these people, brands and marketers and brands, and they can be, heroes can be flawed as well. So, and you have to learn. People are mentioning that. That's terrific. Brilliant. I'm liking what I'm seeing here. So thank you. Someone's got a thinking face, and a couple of pride emojis popping up as well. So I'll leave that open and head back to the deck. And just, I want to say one final thing, which is to leave on a positive, which is that some other data shows that hopefully we've encouraged you, this is the right thing to do anyway, but leaning in LGBTQ plus issues reflects you well as a brand in terms of all your forms of diversity. We said lean in on each of these specifically and commit to them, but they do show your willingness, and I think Phil was making this point, to be an active force for change, a creative, and you can do that whatever you lean into, as long as you do it appropriately. So that's just a positive reminder that this is a great thing to do. And I will leave it there and just finally say thank you to everybody for joining, and to particularly our panel for such brilliant insight. And I'm only sorry we didn't have 90 minutes, because could have kept going forever. Thank you very, very much, and have a great afternoon, everyone.